Good morning. Good morning. Please be seated. Thank you. Please be seated. Whether you're an ambassador or a bishop, please be seated. Shall we get started? Thank you. Well, it's a rainy morning, and it's going to rain all day. Blessings falling from the sky like the gentle rain. We have an extraordinarily packed, but hopefully illuminating, exciting, occasionally infuriating series of conversations today. Where is Edward? So we're going to start our morning with Abdulrazak Gurnah and our Akpam, and then I, the faithless, will conduct a conversation with the Bishop and the Reverend on how we can go from faithlessness to faith, or perhaps vice versa. We have the Ukrainian ambassador with us to talk about rumors of war. And money matters with some of the friendly oligarchs in the room later in the afternoon. And then I will come back on stage to have, I hope, an interesting conversation with John Carling about the nature of luck in our lives and what that should impel us to do in our relationship with other people. And in the afternoon, we have a series of conversations with the people who try to make sure that society recognized those who were most suffering during the pandemic, but also how to deal with similar events in the future that almost certainly awaits us. We have a couple of doomsday sayers who are going to tell us about the fires next time. And then, perhaps my favorite part of the day, which will take place inside the Stellenbosch University Museum, about 5 minutes drive or so from here. We'll all pile on buses to go there. Is the composer Neil Muyanga deconstructing the song Amazing Grace and its many surprising origins and what it has come to mean. And then he will return tonight to the Shebeen with a full band to perform after dinner. So people with stamina, and even those who are not so persevering, should try to show up at the Shebeen tonight. It's going to be very special. Plus, we would have a DJ on hand to close the evening as well. So I hope you have had a good experience so far as we get our day started. And I will now invite to the stage our Akpam and Abdulrazak Gurnah.
Good morning. Such an honor to be here and to thank Dere and his team for inviting us here, but also an honor to share the podium with Abdulrazak Gurnah who actually, if you recall, I said I first met you in 1986. I was an actor in a play, and you were one of our hosts and so on in Kent, in Canterbury.
Yes, I didn't know that. I mean, I remember the occasion.
Right, right.
I remember you came with the play, which I don't know.
Was
some of you-
Albert, yeah.
Was Albert.
Yeah,
But you probably looked a bit different.
I was younger, yeah. Very young, yeah. But so I wanted to start off, because we have just an hour, so by probing those questions, of course, the inevitable Nobel Prize life after that, but also life before that, how you wandered through the world as Abdulrazak Gurnah.
Okay. He wants me to tell you my life story. So I left Zanzibar when I was 18. It was a very difficult time at that time in Zanzibar. The revolution had occurred, like it was been about 3 years earlier. But at the age of 18, I'd finished school, and there was, for some for some reason, incomprehensible really reason, the government decided that we didn't need any more schooling beyond that level that we'd got to. So there was you couldn't go anywhere else, that's it, finish. And we were all sent off to do various jobs. I was sent to teach in a country school, by which I mean that, I don't know if you have that here, probably you don't, but in Zanzibar at that time, a country school, you couldn't be sure exactly of the ages of the school children, if I can call them that, because some of them were already married, but particularly the women, unfortunately, because often girls were forced into early marriage. And there I was teaching people, I wasn't trained, but teaching people who were, in some cases, as old as I was. Anyway, it didn't seem like it had a future, this life. And so I decided to leave, or rather wanted to leave to go find some other place where I could continue studying, basically, but, just find something more fulfilling to do. But at that time, you couldn't leave for another rather obscure reason or incomprehensible reason. I think it was to do with the advisors. After the revolution, the people that the government made friends with were mostly at that time what we would have called then, I suppose, the Soviet bloc, socialist countries. And the security advisors were the GDR, the DDR, East Germany. And they, I think, had this obsession about preventing people from leaving. And they passed this on to the government of Zanzibar. So you couldn't get a passport, in other words. You couldn't leave. You couldn't go anywhere for whatever reason, unless they wanted you out. Then in which case you were expelled with no ceremony. But if you did leave, then you had to leave illegally in some way, get some papers somehow or the other, turn yourself into, I suppose, what we would now call an asylum seeker. But it did mean that you couldn't go back if you did that. If you did, we didn't know what would happen to you, whether you'd be jailed or what. There were various rumors going around that some people disappeared when they tried to get back, but we don't really know. Anyway, so I ended up in England. And the reason is, as always, not so much now, but in a kind of how should one say, in a kind of a traditional way or something like that, but migrations or dislocations of people. People often follow where somebody they know has already gone. This doesn't always mean that that's where you desire to be. It's just that's the only place you know, because there's somebody there that you who will kind of, I suppose, in some way or another, connect with you. In my case, my cousin was finishing his PhD at the University of London, so poor fella had a relative turn up. So that's how we ended up. My brother and I ended up in England, and it was difficult because, well, you're 18 years old, don't have any money, don't have any skills, don't have any education, don't have very much sense even when you're 18. And then you just have to work things out.
Wow. So if that time in Zanzibar imposed a certain kind of stagnant reality, or a wall, so to speak, that you had to scale to leave.
Yeah, well, you don't know. Well,
Yeah.
I didn't know, but I'm sure a lot of the young people who, or particularly young, I expect this also is true of older people, but certainly when you're young, you don't know. You think you're going somewhere, but you don't know what you're leaving behind. You don't understand that part of it. So the negotiation that I had to make, and I'm sure many people in similar circumstances of all ages have to make, is to negotiate as well both of those experiences, the experience of leaving and the experience of arriving, in a sense, and arriving and then you haven't left after all, because the other place continues to live as you are. And negotiating between these two things is, I think, probably a process that doesn't finish. I think it continues.
So would it be right to say those memories were both liabilities and assets at the same time for living in England?
Well, whatever you call them, you couldn't do anything about them.
Right.
I mean, in a sense that you couldn't not remember. So the way memory works, I think, is not something you prompt. There are different things. Of course, you can remember, you can try to remember something because you want to recall it. But the way the life experience, as it were, of a before or of another place, or indeed of anywhere that you have gone through, a person has gone through, I don't think you have any choice about remembering or not remembering unless you're a very, very strong person who can stamp on things and keep them out of the way. Because they kind of lurk around and spring at you when you're not. But imagine that if you're a writer, then you open one little door and a whole load of stuff also come out. And then you think, why waste it? Let's think some more about that. And then more stuff comes out. So in that respect, it never quite finishes this process of both living the before and living the now, as it were.
I recall we were having a conversation earlier about it wasn't just linear from Zanzibar to England. You also returned back to Africa. You went to Kano in Nigeria to teach and so on. What was that like at that time?
It was a shock. No, it was very important actually, because I had just completed my PhD, and it was I was very keen. I knew I couldn't go, at that point, I still couldn't go back to Zanzibar. And there weren't really many jobs for a newly, graduated, whatever. But Nigeria then was just inviting people to come and work, particularly in the universities. There was a great expansion of universities. And so I thought, right, that's the next best thing, as it were, to going somewhere I know. It'll be going back to Africa. And there was some naivety in that, I think, because I didn't really understand at that time just how different and complex and whatever. So it was my own innocence that made it a complicated experience. But there were many things to learn, and it was as a learning experience. It was a hard 2 years, but in many other ways, it was a very fulfilling experience.
And one thing people maybe would not remember because of your amazing success as a writer is that you are actually a scholar of literature. You are a specialist on post-colonial literatures, both from Africa and the Caribbean and Asia. And you were both a theoretician, a historian of this media that the various writers wrote about, and so on. And I just thought maybe you want to put a little bit of a flag on that.
Yeah,
because,
sure.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I spent 35 years teaching at the University of Kent until a handful of years ago. So my entire adult life, as it were, has been by plan, as it were, deliberately, has been both as an academic and a writer. It was something I said to myself. I said, well, this is one of the things I can say. This worked, because I remember when I was still an undergraduate, I thought to myself, what's my ambition? Well, I want to be a writer, and I want to teach in a university. These are the two things I want to do. So it was great that it was possible to do both.
Right, yeah. And now you're an emeritus professor at University of Kent in Canterbury.
That's correct, yeah.
Which, as you said, is just an excuse for giving you access to the library.
That's it. Sometimes people who are not familiar with universities, they think emeritus means that you're some kind of special professor. It doesn't. It just means you get a library ticket.
I just want to come back to something about your writing, because I think, like most people who are familiar with your works, 10 novels, several short stories, there is a recurring theme about people who are in the crossroads of histories. And in this case, one of the biggest crossroads of histories that's usually omitted in evaluating African literature is the Indian Ocean and its impact on Africa, and especially the theater of Zanzibar. I mean, I'm just wondering what you may want to say about that.
Yes, sure. I mean, I think that as we were going through our school, our youth, and so on, this also coincided with the period of decolonization, so the early to mid-60s. And so most of the things that we would have been reading at school in the earlier years would have been the usual fare of that time, which probably people don't read anymore. But there would have been, for a moment, I'm struggling to remember what they were. But, you know, books like The African Queen, possibly a Conrad story, the Man-Eaters of Savo. Has anybody read that book? Well, if you went to a school in East Africa, you probably would have read it.
King Solomon's Mines.
King Solomon's Mines, those kinds of things. But also at that time, other writers, other books were beginning to appear. And those books like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Ngugi's early books, Weep Not Child and The River Between, etc. And we were reading those, or we were beginning to read those. I studied those, and then when I went to university, I studied more of that out of choice, not because they were on the curriculum, because they weren't. But I read those books and so on. But I found that we weren't there, what you're calling the Indian Ocean, or what I would call the Indian Ocean world. I found that we weren't there in this way of thinking about the realities, if you like, of Africa. So no, there's no better reason, I think, for a writer than to say, I see something that's not there, and I'm going to write about that, because that's, I know that. I don't see myself here, or at least I don't see myself here fully. I see glances of myself, but not the world we live in. Strangely enough, it was reading things like The Mystic Mercer, V.S. Naipaul's early novel, and seeing that that's familiar. And I think it's something to do with that, the way that there are many different cultures mingling in that experience, which is also our experience, both historically and as well as in a way out of choice. You know, that it is, so people traveled across the ocean to other parts of the ocean, not because they had to, because they were forced to, like those who were taken to the West Indies and the Caribbean generally and North America, but because that was a chosen way of living, of connecting. So that's my interest in that, is both to, which includes South Africa, by the way, the Indian Ocean. I mean, my interest in that is both because it's there, if you see what I mean, and also because it's such a rich and complicated world, and I think it's good to know about it.
No, absolutely. I think the evaluation of African literature is always seen mostly through the prism of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was a good complementary archive that all your books actually have actually tracked those archives for us by including that part of Africa that's usually excluded in its literature or in its early literatures.
And it gives me a great deal of pleasure not only to have, to have been able to do that, but also it has, I think, prompted other writers to do that. Not as to follow an example, but because it actually says this is a subject. I feel this too, so I want to write about that. I'm thinking of a writer like the Kenyan Yvonne Adhiambo Owo, for example.
Right.
And her latest book, which is called Dragonfly Sea, I think, which very much does this. In her case, China and the island of Lamu. And as many of you know, there is a China connection with the east coast of Africa, as there is an Indian connection and an Arab connection, and etc.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, just sometime last year, when I was in Zanzibar, they've been doing a dig, there's an archaeologist called Mark Horton, who generally operates from the UK, but he's been doing an archaeological project, I suppose, for decades in Zanzibar. And one of the results that he's found, and he has his team there, mostly Zanzibaris, who continue the dig throughout the year, and he comes over for a semester or something like this to kind of keep things going. But one of the things they found over these years is the extent, as they keep digging further. I think they're now around about the 6th century after Christian era, of the Christian era, and they keep finding this evidence of transactions, as it were, from so many different parts of the Indian Ocean, not just as is assumed, sort of like India, South Arabia. And modern science has enabled them. So this is, I don't know if there are any archaeologists here, but something to do with how they can analyze ceramics.
Yes.
Yeah. But they've been able to, apparently now they can analyze not only the age of the ceramic, but the style of the ceramic, what's in it, where it's most likely, where its source is most likely to be, and even more amazing, which workshop this would have been made in.
Right.
And so they're able to actually trace things as far away as Thailand or Siam, as it would have been called then, China, India. And this exchange, this movement going on for all these centuries.
Yeah, in fact, it references the adventures of Admiral Chung He,
Exactly.
the Ming Dynasty, and its contact with Africa, the Indian Ocean. In fact, way before Columbus, actually.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying 6th century AD, some of these things.
Yeah, and that's a huge historical archive that's usually omitted and so on.
Sure. I mean, we didn't know this ourselves. And so you find out that, in fact, these connections and this history is so much longer.
Yeah.
And it extends, amazingly enough, these finds, because there are other people doing these sorts of activities elsewhere, in South Africa, for example.
Correct.
And they find the same ceramics.
Yeah.
So somehow there is also a further connection across the continent, as well as the ones across the sea.
Right, absolutely. What's something about the environment of Zanzibar, the crisscrossing of cultures, from the Arabic to the German to the British and so on, even French, I guess, what people loosely call a Swahilism and so on.
You've just written a book about it.
I did actually, and when we were looking, my co-author and I were looking for a reference point on how to tell these disjointed histories. We had to use your books, actually, Paradise and Before Departure one and Afterlives, because it gave us the excuse to write the book in story form. What could have been a cultural history? That book is called Sojourners, Sultans, and Slaves, and really looks at the Indian Ocean and Africa, and Africans who went all the way to current-day India and so on. But your stories gave us that reference point, or the audacity, actually, to write it as a story in story forms. And so on.
I'm glad I was of use.
Yeah. But there, I think in your writings, what we talked about, that the style of your writing, the stories, the characterization, they're heavily influenced by a literary tradition, a cultural history that's so peculiar to those contexts that we see in East Africa, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa, but especially in that little island of Zanzibar.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that I found a way of speaking or evoking something of that way of narrating and so on. I think of stories, or I think of stories. Let's call them stories. I could use a bigger word, but let's call them stories. As expressing a view of the world, or how you see the world. This is not to say this is what a writer does necessarily, because there may be other sorts of ambitions that a writer has. But the way people tell stories to each other, and in a community, the stories are ways of saying, this is the world, this is how we see it. This is what Koreans are like, this is what the Chinese are like, this is what they do, this is what Christians are like, or whatever. Doesn't mean that those are true, or rather accurate, I mean. But what it does do is it says, this is how the world looks like to me. And so amongst other things, one of the things I wanted to do is to kind of get at that too. But of course, particularly with a novel, with prose writing, I think of it as a complex artifact. It doesn't just do one thing. In fact, if it does just one thing, it probably is going to be rather dull. But there are many things. So this is just one of the things. But there are many other issues and concerns, justice, what we are like as humans, love, and indeed, in the end, just trying to write so that it's a pleasure to read.
One thing that strikes me in your books is this, despite people go in their longing to become subjects across time, across place, and so on, despite the questionable places they belonged to, they were always stubborn and resilient in building new homes for themselves. So, and that's, I remember when we had that conversation with Dele, the question is, what is home to you? Is it the place you left, or the place you reassemble your things in?
Yes, well, as I kind of started when we started to speak right now, I was saying that it's not like you give one up and then occupy another, because both of these places sort of stay with you. Well, you can't avoid the place where you live, as it were, in a practical sense, being with you. But it's an interesting question, especially for people with the experience like myself, which is, of course, millions of people. I'm not one, but one of millions. And of course, I'm referring in particular to people who are traveling from formerly colonized territories and then traveled to either Europe or North America. I don't know very much about North America. This question of what does it mean, home? It's a question that I imagine people ask themselves, but it's also a question that is one often has to confront, because you're faced with it. That people want you to say. So, sometimes people are scandalized when they're asked, so where are you from? I'm not, because it does seem to me, I mean, I don't ask the question anymore, even if I'm interested, and I look at somebody and I think, I wonder where this person's from, but I daren't. Yeah. because people find it offensive. And I suppose they find it offensive because they want to say, this is home. So why are you asking me that question? But I think it's a fair question, because even for those who find it a difficult one, sooner or later, they'll say, actually, my parents are from Cyprus, or whatever it might be, which is really the question that you want to ask. You want to say, give me the antecedents, as it were. Not that you don't belong here, but, tell me the other connections. And I think this is worse for, like I said, people coming from formerly colonized territories, because I've often, again, from experience, find people are not at all cautious about saying, my parents were Russian refugees, or my parents were, Polish, or something like that. So it's something to do with how far the other home is, I think, at least in terms of culture, if not in terms of geography or distance. That somehow there is a sense of having become treacherous to one place in order to claim another place. So you may remember there's a little famous incident of one conservative minister who's saying, so when India and England are playing cricket, which team do you support? And this is a way of judging whether you're a loyal British person or not. And of course, the answer would be India, of course. Why would I support England? So the answer to the question of what does it mean to say home, I think, for me, depends what you mean. You shake me in the middle of the night, I like this way of describing it, in the middle of the night, and you say, where's your home? I'll most likely say Zanzibar. But on the other hand, if I'm here and I'm saying we'll be going home next week, I'll probably mean where I live. And I don't see any conflict in that. They're both homes, they're just different kinds of home. One is where I live, and one is where I was born. And in some ways, where I was born, it matters very much where I was born. And I would hate, and it won't happen, of course, but I would hate if somebody there were to say, no, you don't belong here. Equally, I would hate if I'm trying to get back to England, somebody says, we don't want you back here, go. They're both my homes.
Right, yeah. Well, I know bureaucratically you're also put in a situation where you can't have two passports.
Yeah, well, in our case, you can.
Right.
But in our case, we can't. So Tanzania is one of those African countries, or not only African, but certainly one of those countries that says you can only have a Tanzanian passport. You can't hold another passport. So if you're working, as I've been doing for the last 50 years in the UK, it makes complete sense to be UK, especially because they didn't want me back there. Now it's okay.
Right. Now they'll claim you, of course.
But I mean, it was possible to return long before the Swedish Academy put the finger on me.
Right.
But it was a change of a generation. The government is the same people have been running the country for the last God knows how long. But there was a generational change, and that loosened things up and allowed people who had left, like I did, to return. So it's okay now.
So I guess because after the Nobel Prize, a lot of journalists were always posing that question: is he Tanzanian or is he British? And of course, the horrors from the British literary critics was that, no, he's not. He's just an immigrant and so on. So they were always embracing and releasing you at the same time, so to speak. How did you deal with all of that? Because I know you had many questions from journalists about your actual identity. Were you an African writer who just won the Nobel Prize, or were you a British person who just won the Nobel Prize?
I just didn't answer that question because it seems to me there's self-evident information. I'm from Zanzibar.
Right.
I wasn't able to live there. I moved to find a life. I lived in England. I found a life, and I wrote what I've written. it didn't concern me very much, really, which party showed the greatest enthusiasm for this award. As it turned out, the greatest enthusiasm came from Africa, without doubt. And that pleased me.
Yeah.
I even had an email from the president of Tanzania,
Oh.
which was, hey, I've made it. Congratulating me. So, and in fact, there's been very little in that way from the British side. But that doesn't concern me. I didn't do it for that. I wasn't writing because I wanted the British or indeed anybody else to say, okay, we celebrate you. I was writing for other reasons, which is to do that these things interest me, concern me. I want to investigate them, and I want to. Well, writing is a complicated thing, as I've already said. Because there is always that, there is always a desire to make something beautiful, and so on. So those are the reasons for writing. But when something like this happens, then it has an impact. It's a global award, really, in a way. Everybody wants to know about it, to celebrate it, if they're on your side, as it were. If they say, who's this guy? I think, yeah, okay, fine, thanks. You go your way, I go my way. It's not my problem.
And your works have been translated a lot after the Nobel Prize, in fact, into Swahili as well, and other African languages, Arabic as well. And I'm hoping that a lot of younger folks actually read them, because I think actually the African continent, people still read more than elsewhere. I mean, definitely more than in America, most definitely more than the United Kingdom. And so there is a whole literary tradition or custom. My hope is that through teaching these books and through publications or abridged versions or whatever, that it trickles down to the younger generation of Africans who are really constructing stories and imagining how to even survive everyday life, but also how to cultivate that resilient hope that's always in all of your writing. There's a certain kind of humanistic tradition that all of these stories exemplify. And my hope is that this is transmitted broadly.
I think you're pessimistic. I think people do read everywhere. They do read more than you're suggesting.
Okay.
I believe so.
Right.
Well, two things really in response to your comment. The first is about translations. So one of the greatest consequences, I suppose, that's why I think of it as a global award, is the way that so many publishers, put it like that, want to have, because a lot of people can read in English. You'll be surprised. I was anyway. But they want to read these books in their own languages. So they want to translate these books. I guess it's to translate them for those people who can't read English. And so one of the great things, one of the great pleasures, has been the number of translations that have resulted in this. The most surprising one for me, I suppose, all of them, so many surprising. Uzbekistan. I think, what? Okay. The Basque want to have their own translation. And so on and so forth. So even though you think, well, is it really necessary? But there is something else. There's something about people wanting to read in their own languages. Indeed, of course, Swahili translations. Etc. In India, there's so many different languages,
Right.
and several translations in different languages. It's just wonderful to know. That's why I'm saying you're pessimistic. It's just,
Right.
It's just wonderful to know that people want to read in their own languages and want to read something they've heard about that's interesting. I'd like to know more about that. So that's the first part of what you were saying. The other part about what you're speaking of, which you also mentioned earlier, the idea of people somehow, I think of it as retrieving something out of experience, out of trauma. And that capacity that we have, I think, as human beings, of course, not everybody in the end has it, because some people may be too destroyed. We were hearing yesterday about malnutrition, for example, and how that disables people from being able to retrieve anything very much. But I think for most people, traumatic events, even deeply traumatic events, do not mean that's the end, as well, because we're able often to retrieve something from that. So if the traumatic event in question is dislocation, say, for example, which might mean having to go through the experience of crossing the death waters in the Mediterranean or the English Channel, or it might mean trying to get away from your home being bombed, or your relatives being mistreated or murdered. Those traumas, it does seem that people can, when given an opportunity, that they can retrieve something from that. So I believe that, and I write about that. So in that respect, I do see a kind of resilience, which is something to celebrate.
And I think right now, of course, what's happening in Europe, particularly in Britain, is peculiar as a backdrop to interpreting your works, right? For instance, with the current government in power, and the irony of children of immigrants being anti-immigrant, and so on. It really kind of makes your work pops out to say, well, didn't they read this? And so on.
Yeah. Well, it is an amazing thing, isn't it? It is amazing. It is incomprehensible. And these are people who are, I think both cases, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, were both people whose parents went to the UK as, if not quite refugees, well, refugees of a kind. And the only reason that they weren't quite refugees is they beat the new law that was brought in to make it impossible for those parents to make that journey peacefully, as it were. So they just beat that by weeks. If they'd come the following year, they would have had the same experiences as the people they're trying to keep out now. It's just so difficult to understand how they, as the next generation, can be so inhumane. And the language that they use of kind of criminalizing these desires for safety or prosperity, as if it's somehow immoral to want to become more prosperous.
Yeah, they use terms like economic migrants and so on.
Yeah, and you want to say, well, what's wrong with that?
I know, right.
Well, I mean, of course, in North America, in the USA, they do this as well, about the people coming through from Central America and further south.
Yeah, and let me just go back to writing a bit and to look at, I don't want to put you in trouble, but to say the collection of writers who really you reference and who inform your own writing.
Listen, I've been reading, seriously reading, for at least the last 55, 60 years. As opposed to the reading you do when you're just dabbling around as a kid and so on. And I think of this, when people ask a question which is kind of leading you to say, which writers do you think highly of, or something like that.
Right. I'm trying to avoid that.
You're trying to avoid,
I'm avoiding that, actually.
You're doing it in a tricky way. But it's difficult to answer that question, because it just read and read and read and read, and sometimes you think, oh, this is fantastic. I will read everything that Saul Bellow has written, and then afterwards you get to a point, for whatever reason, you think, I can't stand Saul Bellow. I don't want ever to read a single word of his. So I can go through a list of writers or of works that I've read over the years and admired and so on, but there may no longer be writers whose work I admire anymore. Sometimes it's for good reasons. Sometimes it's for reasons because you come to understand, to an understanding of what it was that you want to reject a point of view. I'm thinking here, for example, somebody like, a writer like V.S. Naipaul. And I think I read everything he's ever written, but I don't think I can read him again. Because when I reread for purposes of writing an academic piece or something like that, and I think, how come I didn't see that? How come I didn't understand that this is a racist tract? But once you've seen that, then it's very difficult to... We've recently had the experience of learning more about the US-American writer Philip Roth. And I have the same response there. I find I cannot, although I read him for many years, I find I don't want to read this guy anymore. And it's not necessarily to do with writing. Well, it is in a way. It is in a way, because the person writing is writing about experiences like that in a way that made it seem amusing or made it seem believable. But now you think, no, now that I know what this man was like, then there is this other undercurrent that I was missing. And now when I read again, I see it, and I just can't get over that, to say, this was what I liked, because this other thing is kind of like a disturbance in between. So in answer to your question, there are a few survivors from this experience. I think Dickens is wonderful, for example. I can read Dickens anytime. I think South African, Coetzee, I think is a wonderful writer, and many others. But what I also really like is how many new, or rather younger writers are coming through, particularly young women writers from Africa. I mentioned Yvonne Odiambo. I might also mention Nadifa Mohammed from Somalia, or Maza Mengiste. Yeah. So there's so many really interesting, very accomplished writers coming through, which is wonderful.
Thank you. I'll just open up for questions from the public. If anyone has a question, comment to make. This is the moment. There's a microphone or two roaming around.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I know you've tried to deal with the question of where home is and home in exile, but a fellow writer of yours, Naguib Mahfouz, said, home is not where you were born, but where your efforts to escape cease. And so my question really is whether you see yourself ever relocating fully back to Africa to live sort of your later years, or if you are fully settled in England, in which case I think we can conclude based on that saying that home for you is England.
We thought we got rid of this question, but we're back to it.
Okay, if you conclude that way, that's fine. You keep your conclusion.
In your opinion, what makes a good storyteller?
Various. I'll tell you what, I'll answer that question in a slightly different way. What is it that a piece of writing does? Well, I think of the primary thing that a piece of writing does is it gives pleasure. So if I'm reading something and I'm not getting any pleasure out of it, it's very likely, for whatever reason, either because it's dull or because its opinions are not ones I share or want to share, then I think, well, I'm not going to read this. So that's that. So if it doesn't give pleasure, it doesn't work. So in the first instance is that we get pleasure out of it. And the other reason that the other thing that writing does, or what we would consider to be good writing, is that it tells us something that we didn't know, possibly. Brings news, tells us something we didn't know. Now, it could also be that it's something we already know, and it affirms that. So we kind of like share that opinion, say, yes, that's how I think. Or indeed, it might be something we don't agree with, but it's dealt with in a way that is intelligent, or that forces you to listen, in a sense. And also, in the end, to say, I know where I stand on this, but okay, fair enough, I've listened to you. So what makes a good story is when all of those things are present in one way or another. Of course, it could be only one of those is present in any bulk. So it could be something that you read simply because it's pleasurable and nothing much in the way of news is there, but nonetheless it's charming or something like that. Or whatever, those other things. So in answer to your question, what would make a good story? You want those things in it.
Good morning. Thank you for everything you're saying and have written. In the North, we're now hearing this sort of drum roll of talk about the death of the novel, and the idea that somehow the combination of the ways reading patterns have changed and patience levels have changed thanks to the internet and so on, coupled with somehow the novel itself as a form, as some kind of antique, some ancient text. What do you say to those who are making that allegation?
To be perfectly honest, I'd say nothing to them. But on the other hand, it is possible to respond to that. If somebody I love came and said that stuff, and I'd want to say, look, I'm going to try and save you from that ignorance. And if you don't find pleasure in the way that I've just been describing, in engaging with the text, then perhaps it's fine, go and do something else. But a lot of people do, a lot of people still do, find that they can engage in a deep way with a piece of writing and return to it. Sometimes it could be you're not ready for whatever reason, it's not the right moment, but I don't think we're about to see the death of story, if you like.
May I go? I've got a mic. I've got two questions. I'm here?
Yeah, okay.
So I'm just checking if you had a change of heart and mind overnight. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you yesterday, which you would not answer.
I know what's coming, I know what's coming. I said take it off the agenda, but she's still coming back with it.
Okay, well, what is your favorite story that you've written? So that was the cheeky question. The second more serious one is, if you could please just talk to us a little bit about your methods. So, for example, would you go and steep yourself in place, to write about the place, because your descriptions are so vivid? The historical context seems to be accurate, even though I don't know as much history as you do. So how do you get that right? It's obviously still fiction, but it's in a historically accurate context. You describe the landscapes in a way that is vivid. Do you go live in these places for a while, researching the story?
No, I don't. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to get down to doing any writing. In some cases, in the first place, many of the places I write about, or at least the primary locations anyway, are places I'm probably already familiar with. Familiar through experience, because I may have been there sometimes many years ago as a child or as a traveler. Sometimes through just reading and knowing about it, or reading other people's accounts of these places. And I guess some of it is just imagining it. Trying to, because places, even if they're different, are not that different that you can't somehow get to know them in other ways. But ultimately it is, I think, to do with writing. So this writing is not a matter of just going, seeing, and writing it down, say. So going there is not necessarily going to give you that sort of intimate knowledge of a place. It will give you a kind of feel, what a friend used to call, you get the dust up your nostrils, as it were. So you get a feel for it, and perhaps it might, a smell or something like that. But it's not, I don't think it's just simply seeing and reporting what you're seeing. It's something to do with imagining, putting yourself there, and kind of trying to sense what it would be like to be there. And this is a fairly lengthy process of revisiting and revising and so on. So when it convinces me, then I think perhaps it might convince you. The first question is to do with what is your favorite novel amongst your production. And I tried to tell you yesterday, but by citing Dickens's answer, which is to say they're all my children.
Yeah.
So I think we'll leave it there. Huh?
No favorite ones, yes. But I think the question underscores how your novels are deeply historical. It almost makes you a historian of sorts. And I think that's probably one of the points she's making, how you are a historian of sorts. It's just you narrate those histories through the novel, through fiction, and so on.
Well, I do also, yeah, sure. I wouldn't refuse that description at all. But of course, I do also write other novels which are not historical, because, I mean, when we talk about historical novels, in a way, it's like we're saying this is an account of another time. I like to think that even historical novels are about our time, rather than that they are telling us about something in the past. Sure. But there are, in fact, other books which are really kind of in the present moment, in that sense too, in the sense of their period. But I wouldn't object to being thought of as somebody who writes about history. Right. In fact, often I think, have I made the right, when I was as an academic as well, have I made the right choice? Should I have been doing history?
Right.
I didn't ever think, should I have done physics? But
yeah, we're running out of time. Just one more? No? I'm being told to cut it. Okay, can we just take yours? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I've been trying to get and good morning and thank you both. I've been trying to get my mind around the word exile and its meaning, not in a legalistic sense, but nonetheless in a technical sense. What does the word actually mean? And for me, I'm thinking about it, and I might be doing so incorrectly, against the backdrop of push factors and whether pull factors are also relevant for the definition, as it may be, of exile. Do pull factors allow one or to use the term exile, or is it predominantly push factors? Or
it's so nice to hear those two little words. I remember push and pull influences in migration. I would have thought exile is to do with neither. That's my view on it. I think of exile as somebody who is forced as a result of holding certain principles, who is forced out of his or her home, ancestral home. When we make a choice to leave, I don't think that because I'm not stopping anybody else from using the word in a different way, but for me, when you make a choice to leave, it doesn't seem to me that that is exile. But if you are forced because of principle, so I don't even think somebody who's a refugee is necessarily refugee in the proper sense of that word, not in the way that it now covers everybody who's on the move, but a refugee that is somebody who's fleeing to save his or her life. I don't think that is exile. So that's how I think of it, that exile implies a principled position rather than a position of dire straits.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank Abdulrazak and all of you. If you haven't read his books, there are lots of them out there. They're amazing books. Please catch those books. And you can always ask him more questions in future.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Akwam, Dean of Arts and Humanities, NYU Abu Dhabi, and my newest brother, Abdulrazak Gurnah. Thank you.
Thank you.
You might agree that that was a pleasurable conversation, and perhaps it is time to raise the temperature just a little bit so that maybe there is less pleasure in the next conversation and more discomfort. Nevertheless, it's a pleasure to welcome to the stage Bishop Malusi Upumwana and the Reverend Alan Story. Maybe just a very brief introduction to Bishop Umpumwana, who was a close friend and associate of Stephen Biko, and whose wife, who is here with us, was, if anything, more of the person who exposed herself to lots of risks in smuggling papers and other messages back and forth, while Biko was isolated and marked for terrible things. I checked. And I say that in the sense of the extraordinary faith and hopefulness that it requires to have gone through a period like that, in which your close friend, confidant, and fellow resistance figure was savagely murdered by the state, not by individuals. And it's directly reflected, of course, in the subject that we're about to tackle this morning, how we can go from that level of hopefulness and faith to perhaps even despair in many ways. Reverend Alan's story is not to be confused for his father, perhaps a more famous father in the struggle to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world, particularly in South Africa. But our subject is not so much South Africa itself today, but more broadly in the way that it affects all of us, how we deal with situations where hope has been dashed, and how do we pull the fragments together in order to live. And so I would ask each of you, starting with the bishop and then the reverend, to make a brief opening statement to set the scene for this conversation. We live in extremely difficult and disjointed times, and perhaps a dose of how to survive might be in order. Bishop.
Thank you. I guess I should start with an episode that Archbishop Desmond Tutu ruthlessly abused at one public event. I was tortured very severely under interrogation under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, and actually wished and prayed that I should die. And of course I didn't. Here I am. And Now, I'm discussing this with the Archbishop Desmond when he was General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches. And he says, how did you survive? I'm trying to answer your question. I said to him, I looked at these people and realized that they had lost their humanity. Now think about this. On weekends, my torturers used to, because this was in Harwick police station in just north of Pietermaritzburg. There is a place called Msinga in the Greytown area where there used to be mutual killings. These guys would go on a weekend for pot shots, killing people, come back to post about it on Monday, and I'm listening to this. So I tell Desmond that they had lost their humanity. And that's when I realized that actually, if we're going to have a country at all, they need us to humanize them. And and of course, I won't go into the occasion when he abused that statement. But you see, it is also then a question of what do you believe is your responsibility in society? You talk about faith and faithlessness. And I would like to just make what I consider to be a necessary distinction between faith as a religious faith, in like believing in the salvation in Jesus Christ on the one hand, and faith in something that a person can and will do, or even an institution. Once, I think it was 1990, we had a breakfast in Port Elizabeth, now the hotel called Kabeja, where Joe Slovo and Chris Hani were present. And Joe Slovo had just written a piece which was very complimentary of the church. I said to him, what made you write so positively about the church this time? He says, the Communist Party has since 1921 been promoting life in the present, in the here and now. And the church has been promoting life in the good life in the hereafter. But more recently, I'm seeing more and more of the church people promoting the good life in the here and now. I have no reason to quarrel with them. And Chris Hani quips in and says, I'm happy to be pleasantly surprised in the hereafter, but I do want to see the good life now. The question then is there a link, therefore, between the faith in Christ, as I do, and the faith that Joe Slovo is talking about, that he thinks he can bring about a state that guarantees that? And of course, we know now that Joe Slovo's guarantees didn't survive. But yes, there is a link, because Jesus says, I have come to bring good news to the poor. What other good news can there be for the poor if it's not about their poverty? To set at liberty those who are captives and to free the oppressed. And he says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. It is this that seized me to say, for that you need a humanized society. And that's why we need to humanize the white oppressors of South Africa. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Bishop. Thank you. Alan?
Thank you, Dele, and thank you, Bishop. I'm going to use the faith and faithless, try and extend some synonyms: faith, faithless, life, death, humane, inhumane. Those who are faithful are for life and are humane. Those who are faithless promote death and are inhumane. So when I use the word faith, I'm meaning humane. It feels to me that life, the fabric of life, is tearing apart. The fabric of life feels like it's tearing apart. If you listen carefully, you can hear the earth groan. And flood and drought and fire dance destructively throughout the world. Another species goes extinct today and another tomorrow. The billionaire list grows as fast as the unemployment lines. Discrimination of this one and that one today and another tomorrow. While eyes are glued to screens following algorithms of fear. And loneliness is the pandemic that spreads without person-to-person contact. Some people's entire life is criminalized. It's criminalized to be homeless. It's a criminal offense to live in that building. It's a criminal offense just to exist for some people. While those in power are too comfortable with the death of others. And indifference and despair marks our diaries. So into that context, if there's any truth to that context, what does faith, faithless, life, death, humane, inhumane mean? The text that I've tried to immerse myself in is the algorithm of 1,000 years of narrative of the human condition, which tells us basically who we are and how we are. Who we are. A story that if you take literally, it's an absurdity. Two people in a garden with talking snakes. You take it literally, it's an absurdity. But it's poetry. Poets have written. Poets are not interested in the facts, they're interested in the truth. And so we're told who we are. We come from the image of more. Let's call the more God. In other words, we dare not reduce the human person to anything less than more. The divine, each human being. Don't forget that every human being is divine. We come from the soil, the story says. We created from the soil, an earth creature. Don't forget that you're from the soil. How you treat the soil is how you treat the self. If you forget that you're from the soil, if you mistreat the soil, you mistreat humanity and all of life. And we're from the rib of each other. We're from the rib of each other. We're from each other. We're interconnected. We're one. We're family. If we forget that we're family, we will have a false sense of separation. And the false separation breeds fear. And fear makes me want to get power to protect myself from that which I now fear, which is you, which I'm now separate from, but in actual fact I'm not. I have a false sense of separation. So I seek power to safeguard my fear for a false sense of separation from you because I've forgotten who I am. And power corrupts. How does power corrupt? It gives me a false sense of superiority. My false sense of superiority breeds arrogance. Arrogance casts out respect for others. And I do not listen to those who I do not respect. And when I stop listening, I stop loving. And so the issues that we are now dealing with in the world are all around supremacy, because we've forgotten who we are. The primary supremacy is human supremacy. Human supremacy no longer listens to the more than human life of the earth. And if I don't listen, I don't love the earth. So I can destroy the earth. And life is groaning. Human supremacy, then male supremacy. 49% of the world's population oppressing 51%. Then imperialistic, colonial, tribal supremacy, you can name it, colonial. Then white supremacy. And we learn from our apartheid history that separate development is a contradiction in terms. There can be no development through separation. And then we have, from white supremacy, we have rich supremacy. We have heterosexual, cisgender supremacy. We have Christian supremacy, white evangelicalism on the continent of North America, one of the greatest threats to democracy today.
So, Alan, I want to bring you back into the circumstances in which we currently exist, and the subject of this conversation more specifically, that when you have a society, as many of us come from these kinds of society, that was founded on hope and was galvanized by its leaders of that time to be pulling in the same direction, however imperfectly. And then, after a period, finds itself torn apart because the system upon which it is built is producing too many losers. And so people no longer have faith in the society in which they live. And everything becomes a fight and a subject of hostility and tension, and there is no room for grace. What I want to try and learn from the two of you, as perhaps somebody who has already fallen like myself, I might be in need of resuscitation, is how do you regain the faith that you have lost? And I don't mean it in a religious sense as such, but if you live in a society where you feel that you no longer belong or are seen or cared for, and you lose faith in that society, and yet in order to progress, in order to build something that could allow life to flourish, people have to willingly get up in the morning to do the necessary work of that repair. How do you regain or rekindle the faith that has been lost? Bishop, you want to go first?
I thought Alan was going to continue where he left off, but I think that it is, we start off, contextual theologians start with what the context is, which is what you bring us to. But the primary context is the first loss of faith, which is why there was a struggle for change. But it was a struggle that was actually inspired, as I was saying earlier, with hopefulness and faith that things will be different. We call this the promise of the post-apartheid South Africa. Everyone that was in struggle had something in their minds, not that you've been able to promise you anything, but we all believed that we would work towards a just, reconciled, peaceful, equitable, and sustainable South Africa that would be free of racism, of tribalism, and I would say today, xenophobia, and gender prejudices, clearly free of corruption and the deprivation that goes with it, and with food and shelter for all, and every child born to grow to its God-given potential. That was the promise. And that promise began to appear to dawn, but over time began to recede. And that's where you're asking, how do we revive that? And I say that we made a big mistake in that we assumed that a new constitution, change of government is the answer, and not commit to the hard-slogging work that has to be done. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu talked about a rainbow nation. That was an aspirational statement. It was not a reality. We needed to do the work to get there. We have a reality that says the Bandustans of this country were built on 13% of South Africa from the 1936 Land Act. That didn't change in 1994. People still live in those Bandustans where their homes have got no equity value. And how do you then make those people hopeful for anything? What new faith can they have? You have, therefore, need to say, let us work to have one identity. We live in the same real estate called South Africa, but we're not one nation. There has to be a special effort to create a common nationhood with public values that we can all identify with. And I think that's where some of the direction will lead.
So, Alan, we were at dinner together in Cape Town some months back. I think it was in April or so. And you made a remark to me that you have sort of processed the period that this country is going through now as a necessary wandering in the darkness of the forest, as a way of giving yourself the hope that it is also possible to emerge on the other side. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Earlier, you brought me back. I hadn't left the subject. I'll reclaim that.
I am the shepherd.
All right. So, I think, so again, I was mentioning the ancient text, scripture 1,000 years old, of an algorithm. Once you've got 1,000 years, you can see patterns. And so to answer Deli's question there, we see the pattern of slavery moving into a land of promise, land of oppression movement. And what do we notice? What does the algorithm teach us? We move from land of oppression not instantly into land of promise. There's wilderness. And so we learn from the algorithm of that history that there's no direct route from oppression to promise. No direct route. You've said it yourself, Dele. How come the graph goes like that? We've just heard now, how come children of immigrants are anti-immigrant? That theme is repaired. How come I got a visa one day and not a visa the next day? Why is the repeat? So surely a gathering like this, we must stop and consider, why is this repeating? And that's where I was going. If you want hope, we need to realize where stuff has gone wrong, and it's gone wrong where we've forgotten who we really are. And we have to remind ourselves of our true identity as human beings every generation, because tomorrow there'll be another supremacy waiting to alienate another, to secure. So if I go back to the ancient story, we're in the wilderness. And again, it was poets. How do you describe freedom? You describe it by rainbows or ocean splitting in two. Poets, that's how poets describe freedom. In the wilderness, they had to write a new constitution. They very wisely wrote it in stone so people couldn't change it too quickly. It was freed slaves who wrote the Constitution, who understood what a sjambok felt like. And because they understood what a sjambok felt like, they wrote it in protection against the misuse of shamboks in the future. If we had a new constitution written today, it would be written differently. But when you've still got the marks of the sjambok, still the tear gas in your nose, then there were shortages in the wilderness. There wasn't enough water, wasn't enough food. And what did they say in the wilderness? It was better in Egypt. And we have that today, people. Now, the only people who say it was better in Egypt are those who never lived in Egypt or those who benefited in Egypt. So we're a few days away from the anniversary of Steve Biko's killing, but assassinations are happening on a weekly basis in this country. Again, so they repeat. And I do believe we're in the wilderness. I think it's hopeful to find out our real location. If this is the promised land, then I want nothing about it. 20,000 people murdered a year. Nearly 4,000 women murdered a year. We've got higher numbers of women being murdered in this country than war zones. That's not the promised land. That's the wilderness where we have to relearn what it means to be human. And here's the pain. The pain is that you know the saying, we can leave Egypt, but Egypt's in our veins. And we've become what we hate. The people in power we hated, we are administering power in the same inhumane ways. And people in power too comfortable with the death of others. And so the ancient text tells us that if you want a healthy society, a hopeful society, prioritize the least. Prioritize the most vulnerable people in society. Prioritize them. Make them the absolute focus of your business, of every single policy decision. Make sure that the least benefit the most. Because when the most vulnerable are feeling safer, everyone feels safe.
Okay, so this is an important point, and I doubt that you will find a single human who disagrees with you. The question is, how do we get to the promised land, to borrow from your language? Because the South Africa, if we take it as an example of the larger subject matter that we're attempting to tackle this morning, having felt the sjambok that you referred to, constructed the world's most liberal constitution, certified by no less than Ruth Bader Ginsburg as the most liberal document that exists in the conduct of human affairs. South Africa had legalized gay marriage before the United States did. Now, this document, Bishop was saying we didn't do the work. I want to get some kind of explanation from your point of view how the vision that was constructed, having felt the sjambok on your back, was not made real. What is the work that you were saying earlier needed to be done that was not done? Because if we all know that we should prioritize the least amongst us and so on, but we continuously put forward leaders who do not know how, even if they profess to believe that. How do you move from point A to point B? Point B being the promised land.
I think that there are at least 3 areas that need attention. Especially if you look at the list. One is the reality that we constructed and created poverty and inequality over generations. And so that's where I think the starting point is, which is why I said, Jesus said, I've come that they may have life and have it abundantly. I've come to bring good news to the poor. There will be disagreements on how to arrive at that, but there has to be a conversation about what shall we do to make sure that we do not have a situation where 99% of South Africa's poverty is concentrated between the so-called Africans and so-called coloreds. If we don't deal with that, we won't have an eruption. Those who designed the July 2021 trouble knew that there was a ready market of poor people that would take advantage of the moment that's created for them. And that's just the beginning. Secondly, we have a legacy of otherness that was created in the divisionism of apartheid. And we have sustained it, which is why our spatial utilization is exactly the same as it ever was in the past. Therefore, we cannot know each other any differently in the new dispensation. And we created provinces that are actually glorified Bantustans. You can't be the premier of Northwest without being Tswana, or premier of KwaZulu-Natal without being Zulu, and even have the Zulu king opening the legislature to confirm the Bantustanization of the province. What do you do if you're not Zulu and in KwaZulu-Natal? If you're Indian, if you're white or Portuguese, you don't belong. So the othering of our society and this balkanization has continued in the new dispensation. That's what I mean when I say we haven't done the work.
Thank you. Thank you. Alan?
Sure, I don't know. I don't know, but I'll give an example. There are around 20 golf courses in the inner city of Cape Town, kind of metro, about 20 golf courses, about 30 bowling greens. Most of them are in the state's hands. 60,000 people were forcibly removed from District 6. It still remains empty. Just 2 of those golf courses could include 60,000 low-cost housing.
What do you have against golf courses?
Now here's the thing.
Dele wants to say hands off golf courses.
I'm sure there are a number of people here who... So if we don't want to give up our golf courses, then we mustn't complain when people come for your houses. And that's not an exaggeration. If we cannot give up our entertainment, where people can live safely and in fact, it's not. There's.
All right, okay.
No, hang
we
on.
don't want to have an argument about golf courses. Thank you.
These things need to be contested. It's not. It's actually environmentally insane, and it's privatized. Little 4 balls walk. Now, if you want to drive an hour, 2 hours away to go play, wonderful. But children should not be getting up at 4 in the morning to walk in the pitch dark, to get on a taxi, to get onto another taxi, to maybe get onto a bus to get to school. And by 8 in the morning, they are tired and hungry. If we could get 100,000 young people that could get to school in 15 minutes, a good school, and be as bright and alert as any other student who's just been dropped off by mom and dad, we would change the trajectory of this country. More development has happened in Khayelitsha post-94 than prior. That's apartheid geography and spatial planning continuing right this second. And it's people in power who must stop worrying about getting, and this is the thing of our short-termism, 4-year, 5-year, and it's not even 4 or 5 years, it's 2 year we're campaigning already But we've got issues that have taken generations to form, and they're going to need all our energy and make some hard decisions to solve. But I'm spending more of my resources and my energy to try and get re-elected. And I use my power to keep myself in power. That becomes the object of my power. Take the ANC, for example. You use your power to bring liberation, you will have power. Use your power to stay in power, and you will lose power. That's taking Jesus saying, if you want to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you're going to say, you know, if you can give it away for the liberation of others, then you will not have anything to worry about.
Thank you. All right. So, if it helps both of you gentlemen to rekindle your own hope, I assure you that these issues are being grappled with in practically every country on earth to varying degrees, which would suggest that there might be a need for acceptance that that's our default position, and that acceptance might actually lead us in good stead to fight the long battle ahead of making life more abundant. If we accept that we're actually not as good as we suppose that we are, we might be able to stay in it longer and not be so easily disappointed. Is there a premise that appeals to you in any way?
I would say absolutely. If I go back to the ancient narrative, so it's slaves. The Ten Commandments was written by freed slaves. So what's on their mind? What do they never, ever, ever again want to happen to them? Is slavery. So they write a constitution that's going to keep them away from slavery. And part of their economic policy was this, that they realized what enables you to go into slavery is first of all financial debt. Because once you get into financial debt, then chattel slavery follows that. And so what did they do? They set up a law of honesty. Every 50 years you push the reset button on the economy and you redistribute wealth. It's called Jubilee. Most radical economic policy there is. Because they were saying this, we know ourselves. We're more Egyptian than we like to admit. They'd give us 50 years in power, and you know what's going to happen. They're going to be people impoverished, and they're going to be people with too much and people with too little. The basis of slavery. So what we're going to do, we're going to be honest and develop a law that will protect us from ourselves. Every 50 years, we'll make sure that no one has too much and no one has too little. Now, there's not much evidence that that has been done. But surely that has to be. I mean, are we aware of the difference between 1 million and 1 billion? 1 million seconds is 11 days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. And we talk of billionaires as if it's not a crime. And I'm using my words deliberately. Until we can get honest about what is truly criminal. We've criminalized the poor for being poor. But to be a billionaire is not a crime. When you have more money than you could ever spend in a number of lives. That's the truth that we need to start getting. That's the truth. If the poor were invited to this conference, we'd be having very, very different conversations.
Well, I didn't want to endanger the golf course, you see. Bishop, I want to go back to, and then I'll open it up a bit because there are people from all over the world here who may get some resonance from the subject matter and might want to chime in. But I wanted to go back to where you began just for a second, because it seems to me understanding what made possible the maintenance of hope and a near certainty for you at the time that this system will crumble, will be defeated, right? What was responsible for that? Because if we understand that, then we have an understanding of how we might escape from the current moment as well, which for South Africa is pretty dire, maybe not as dire for equally for other countries, but what was it that made you nearly certain that actually it's this guy torturing me who is the prisoner? A certainty that your struggle will prevail, and therefore maintained you in the faith that the promised land will be at hand at some point. If people understood that, maybe it might sustain them as we go through this roughness.
I don't know that it can sustain us through this roughness, because at that time, the promise of a post-apartheid South Africa was real in the minds of those that were in the struggle. It's more difficult today, because what ails our society does not come, nor is it executed by apartheid. It might be a legacy of apartheid and our failure to change it, but we are our own oppressors. At the time, all of us were ready to die. I never expected to live to 30. But my friends were dying at that time. But it was kind of okay. But it's not okay now when so many people die for just being truthful. When people are killed for telling the truth about theft, and they get murdered. And therefore, we are in a situation that is worse. It's not Egypt, but it is worse than Egypt because we're causing it ourselves. And that is why we cannot say that which sustained us then is adequate to sustain us today. We have to create a new sustenance that's based on a new hope that I believe includes changing our attitude to ourselves. Now, you mentioned Steve Biko before. He addressed a group of clergy. I think this is 1972, and said, you harangue your congregations with the message of the devil, which is the destination for their sins. Have you ever considered that the people that you're preaching to are poor people, and therefore their theft, their murder, their rape, their lack of education and everything has to do with their poverty? And that if you address those things, you probably might have less. Why is it that you think that rich people are not sinners? Billionaires? They're not sinners because they don't have to steal openly and get arrested. And so there is something to be said about creating the kind of living environment that makes people feel they have a stake. Right now, people do not have a stake, and that's why we're the protest capital of the world.
Thank you. Just brief.
Yeah, I would say what gives me hope around that is that which is built on discrimination or racism, corruption, self-destructs. It's got its seeds. It sows its seeds of its own self-destruction. It does take too long. Absolutely, it takes too long. So it needs pressure to be able to water those seeds and expose and water those seeds of its own self-destruction. Agree.
Thank you. Now, I'll open this up to the audience. So let's start with you in the middle there.
Thank you. Thank you. So, on faith, is it possible? Is focusing purely on faith and not on what we should put our faith in a complete conversation? So, I'm sitting here wondering, are we having a crisis of faith at the moment, or are we having a crisis of what to put our faith in? So that's the first kind of question that I'm grappling with. And then the second one is positive outcomes. Of late, it's about faith in positive outcomes, and we keep speaking about it. Faith about coming through. But there are people who never ever make it through for generations. And what does faith mean for them? What is guaranteed? Are there positive outcomes even guaranteed for us? And how do we maintain faith in spite of not having a guarantee of positive outcomes?
Sure. So for me, the question is faith in what? Growing up under apartheid, the most perverse regime had faith in God and Jesus. They had no faith in equality, justice, and fairness. It seems to me that if there is a God, God would rather us have faith in freedom, equality, and justice than in God. So I'm wary of that. I'm far more interested in working out, what do you have faith in? We dare not lose, whatever religion. Those days are long gone. We need to work. Do you have faith in humanity, the humanness, the equality? Do you believe in equality? Don't ever stop believing in equality. Don't ever stop believing in justice and exploring what justice may look like, possibly may look like, for the earth, for each other. That's what I would, if there is a God, I think God wants us to wrestle with those things.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Bishop? Okay. Over there.
Hi. First, before my question, the picture of Reverend Allen Story looks like a footballer and not like a reverend. So maybe you want to amend that next time.
Beckham.
My question to the bishop and the reverend, you see, if you look at all religions, Christian, Muslims, Hindus, Jewish, it seems the people in that religion, part of them, they will use their God to persecute the others, their God. My question is to you, like I recall when I went to Robben Island to visit where Mandela was in jail, the prisoners didn't know what day of the week it is. The only time they knew it was a Sunday when they took them to church. So how do you think you can connect between the different religion to try to make a different understanding to humanity? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, all those religions have a common thread when it comes to the justice that Alan is talking about. Hinduism contrasts righteousness, compassion, and generosity, self-restraint, with greed and false premises of life. And the Hindu scriptures will do that. And the Muslim scriptures, the Quran, does exactly the same. And the Hebrew scriptures, with the messages of Isaiah and Amos, let justice roll like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So there is a common thread. I currently chair what is called the Interfaith Forum of South Africa, which brings together Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and the Nazareth Baptist Church Abakwashembe, who are not Christians. And when we talk about social justice issues, well, exactly the same messaging. It comes together very well. And so that is not the issue. The issue is how, as you say, once we start othering one another, we use our religion to undermine the other. I told you that I had been tortured here, and the person who tortured me was a very proud German South African, I imagine, to be in the security police. And he was sort of standing up and boasting that he comes from German stock that knows how to torture people. And I thought about what the Nazis did to the Jews and to the Roman. So one of the things that I did was to actually travel to Poland and to Auschwitz, yes, so that I can have a sense of what the relationship is between what I was experiencing. I was horrified with what I actually saw. And what did I do? I said the next trip must be to Israel-Palestine, to see how that experience would have led the Israelis to be more tempered in the way they relate to the others. And I was actually surprised traveling through Gaza and the West Bank to see the horror that I saw there. And I discussed this with my Israeli friends. And so, yes, we can use our faith traditions to find common ground in social justice, but we also can use the same to undermine one another. When we struggled here in Cape Town, marched on Paulsmoor in 1985, I had Sheikh Kabir of the Muslim Judicial Council on my left, and I had a Jewish rabbi on my right. And we were walking hand in hand together like this. And we got attacked together. So, yes, we can be together, but we can also use our positions selfishly against one another.
So as somebody said, the dirty little secret of democracy is the people.
Oh, yes.
So if we have constructed something that is supposed to lead to justice, but it is not made real, then it is because of the people.
And that's why the people must work at it. That's why I say that work it's not the documents that will do that, it's the work we do.
Yeah. Any other questions here? Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me? Okay. Reverend, you mentioned, I heard you mention humanity quite a lot and remembering who we are. And it's something I find interesting because if you look back at history, since history was recorded, human beings have never been humane. That word doesn't actually exist in its true form, in the way it's supposed to be. I would argue that we are now awakening and coming out of a state where we're understanding what it is to be humane. So in looking at the world that we live in and faith and consciousness, should we not be looking at the world going forward and undoing and unthinking the things we've always known to be, rather than trying to remember who we were? As you mentioned, you said we've forgotten who we are. Have we ever actually known who we are? Because I don't think from studying history that we have ever known who we are or ever been human beings in the way that we understand humanity.
Thank you. Ellen?
So I think throughout the ages there have been people who have been able to live and express a deeper humanity that we have been able to see and look at and say, sure, that looks more human. That idea and that enfleshed, bodied idea looks more human. I want to follow that. I want to be more like that. And that's how philosophies, religions have come around, where people have tried to document what maybe is more human. And so that's our project. You're quite right. Our project is how do we become more human? How do we become more humane?
Thank you.
And that's all I would add to that.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you. I studied theology because I wanted to answer the question. What does it mean to be created in the image of God if you're black in apartheid South Africa?
And what was your answer?
It was to say exactly what do the scriptures tell us about God? God is love, and therefore love is a human fundamental. God is creator, therefore creativity is what human beings should be. And God is powerful, Almighty God. But power without love is tyranny, and power with love is justice and righteousness. And this is what then made me believe I would like to be a true representation of that God and whose image I've been created. And I believe that there wouldn't have been the concept of Ubuntu, which really is about love lived, it's a love ethic, if this quest for being human does not exist. It does, but it always comes back to where we fail as human beings, and that's why we have to sustain it on an ongoing basis.
Men being as they are, and the law as they might become. It's a reference, of course, to the idea that we have to make laws to protect us from ourselves, which Alan referred to earlier. But I do feel that we're missing something in the picture from this conversation, which is there are people, possibly in larger numbers than we suppose, who are actually doing the work as we speak, who wake up in the morning and make things better in every way that they can for other people, not themselves. They need to also appear in this picture that we are painting, because people are not like surrendering. The situation may look a little dire. This was provoked in me actually by the comment from Lerato about whether there's ever been humanity. Of course, there's always, there always has been. The question then is to remember what that feels like when we've got a bit too far away from ourselves. So I'd like to sort of hear from both of you as we close this conversation. What are those things that you have failed to remember along the lines of the people who are doing the work, including yourselves that I know of, right? So the picture is not completely bleak. In fact, may not be as bleak as we think, because when you're feeling pain in the presence, it makes it difficult to remember that there are other good things that are also going on. The good news.
The good news is in the fact that because this is a human fundamental, to be human is essentially in the goodness. All of us in the spaces where we actually express that. But what is the challenge is how you institutionalize that and socialize for it in a much more creative and positive and directed way. For example, our education, our public broadcaster should be doing more by way of highlighting the goodness that you're talking about and what more should be done, and make people feel there are certain public values for which we need to positively to inculcate and socialize. And I think that there are enough people from whom we can glean to do that, and I think it can be done.
On opening night, we remember the conversation that included that included a gentleman named Songezo Sebi. Now, there is no assurance that it will be successful, but it seems to me that that is an act of faith in a way to say this country can be fixed, so I'm going to try and go out and work in concert with others to build something else, right? Others are attempting that. Others have attempted it before and it didn't quite work, but there is no guarantee of success. But the very act of starting the journey of looking for new ways of being seems to me an act of faith itself. And is there not something perhaps that should give us some sense that all is not lost?
The fact that we've made it through an ocean into the wilderness should give us hope to be able to cross the river's edge.
I think it's multidimensional in that when we struggled against apartheid, we had artists, we had musicians, we had everybody. I mean, there's a beautiful toi-toi here in Cape Town that said, the mamas, the papas, the omas and the opas, the tanis and the ompis, the kate and the honde, as alles in the struggle. It meant everybody, throw everything in the kitchen sink into it. And so it's not just going to be, yes, I had said politics is important. Certainly it is, but it's not the only thing. And that everything must be involved. And that's why, and that's the reason why I might put my own pitch on this. The religious forum are actually convening a diversity of South African players across next month to talk about exactly this. How do we change the trajectory? We will do this because we invite everybody to participate in that process.
Thank you. Thank you. So then it bears reminding ourselves that as we speak of the high unemployment and all of these things, there are people making beautiful new music, some of which we will experience on Friday night. There are people creating new kinds of food that is healthier for people. There are people making beautiful paintings. There are people inventing new technologies to make our lives easier. And so it's all of these things that also are part of us. And the sun is actually out now, not the gloom that we waded through to get here this morning. And on that note, I thank the Reverend, I thank the Bishop, and let's go have some coffee.
Thank you very much.